Okay, so this is the last episode in my series of reflections on the verses in chapter 25 of the Proverbs. I finished last time with verse 25, and I'm going to continue now with verse 26. There are 3 remaining verses. So without further ado, verse 26. A righteous man falling down before the wicked is as a troubled fountain and a corrupt spring. Now, I can't imagine that there's a person existing that has not had this experience at some level, for which they try to do something that is good, but either by their own poor foresight and understanding, or by their own weakness, they cause greater harm than they do good. And I think that is, at least in my experience, it seems to be something that is, it's constant. It's constant at different levels. At each stage of life, there seems to be things that I have tried to do and to do well, but I've failed in doing them. And perhaps the result or the conclusion of my failure had resulted in an outcome perhaps that was exactly contrary to my intention. And this is a terrible feeling. It causes, and it ought to cause, I think, some anxiety. It ought to cause a period of reflection and pondering at what could have been done differently, or how this could have been changed. Now, I think it'll take some time to unravel this verse and the first part of this verse. And it may on the surface seem that what I have just explained here is not necessarily related to what is being said, or we might consider this to be something that is a slightly different situation. At first glances, it's always difficult to tell. But I think there is a lot to be said about the wicked. There's a lot to be said about one's poor foresight, one's poor understanding or assessment of a situation. And I think that there are interesting questions that are raised within internal conflict, that this verse may be expanded to include that realm or domain of agency that is beyond what we might typically associate with this verse, that between a righteous person and a wicked person, two separate agents on the level of the human experience. But it's possible, as I've mentioned, with this inner self conflict, that the wickedness of deception takes on this form however it comes to us. And in the modern day, I don't think it's very difficult to imagine how this can happen. It certainly doesn't seem to be unreasonable, given how much information is out there and how much directed information is out there on the part of one party or another, or a group of people, whatever. But anyway, I don't want to get too far into the weeds of this before I actually explore the verse. So let's begin. And to begin with this verse, I think there needs to be a discussion or reflection on the word righteous, or righteous man. For we can't really understand what it means for a righteous man to fall down before the wicked if we don't understand what it means to be a righteous man. Now, the goal here is not necessarily to establish some profound insight about the nature of righteousness, but rather at least to give some idea of how we can move forward and to really to consider it a little bit more than just a quick, superficial reading. So let's begin, like many times throughout the interpretations of these verses, with the etymology of the word righteous. So from the Old English, the word righteous originates from the word ritwis, ritwise, rit meaning right or just, and wis meaning wise or way. In Middle English, we have the evolution of the word to rightwise. This included the meaning of being morally right or just. There are influences from Old Norse and Old High German that the word writ, meaning right or law. In modern English, we have righteous, characterized by justice, morality, full of rightness. So putting all of this together, there's an interesting picture that I think forms in my mind, that although the verse isn't necessarily giving us a path, much like if we were to read Plato, for example, there's a specific way in which Socrates approaches a problem. It's the Socratic way. We can also think about the scientific method. The way in which a person chooses to approach a problem is the way in which they find themselves to what is right, to what is identifiably true. Of course, the other side of that is, well, what exactly is this concept of being right or correct, or being just or virtuous? We assume that there are concepts, there are things, there are observations for which we can rely on them. That there is something about the way in which we go about our experience and our lives that it depends on us being right to a degree to maintain our awareness, to maintain our existence. Now, of course, that is nothing more than just to state the obvious. So this is to say that we must give an appropriate account to our judgments, such that it conforms or agrees with the various identities that our own identity participates with, interacts with. And the way in which this is done by a person, I think, can vary, thankfully. Earlier on in the Proverbs, I was using an image often of the mountain. At the top of the mountain, it is that center peak, that is the divine logos. It is that purposeful, reasonable entity behind the creation of everything, the creation of the creator of intelligibility, of being. And around this mountain, there's a large base. There are plenty of different places that a person can stand around this large base. In fact, there are plenty of people that could stand at the base and not be aware that there's other people navigating towards some central point at all, because it's so large. And the image that invokes is this potential. This potential for differing paths, and yet all remaining in the same direction towards that goodness, towards what is right. And for my part, my awareness of other people's approach to what is right, it can be quite poor in relation to my own understanding of how I approach something that is right. Now, I think that there are certain things that we just cannot forego in this pursuit of that which is right. Otherwise, we find ourselves going in the opposite direction, towards emptiness and towards nothingness, not towards creation, but towards absence and towards darkness. So if we imagine that every person has this ability to determine what is right, and within this ability there is some variability, for which one person can come to a conclusion from another path, but still participate with that truth as somebody else would participate in it. And there would be certain qualities of the path itself, albeit in a different location perhaps, that would be equal, that would be equivalent to another path. Now there's one thing that I would like to say here, that I don't necessarily mean to say that there are different truths. I think that the truth is a fascinating thing, it's a fascinating subject. The truth is something that we come to. The thing in and of itself that is true, independent of one's view of it. Whether the person believes that what they see is true or not. But assuming that somebody sees something that is true, let's say, for example, there's an apple in front of me. This apple is quite small, misshapen to a degree. It's not it has no perfect curvature to it. And when I see this apple, I can examine its aspects. I can see that of the apple, there are many characteristics that I can identify. But it is impossible for me to identify them all at once. I only have one perspective of this apple at any given point. Moreover from that, I think that that position is made stronger when I say that the apple that I experience here is only a level of experience. The various receptors, sensors within my body, within my eyes, and within my hands, to indicate to my mind what material object is in front of me. All of these things are limited. And that there is a level and a layer beneath this, that if I stayed here, just turning the apple over and over and over again, I may come to, conceptually within my mind, I may examine or may consider that which is unseen, perhaps that which is behind the skin, or that of the skin itself as I move it closer to my eyes and I see finer and finer detail. I may wonder, what of the detail that my eyes cannot perceive? Certainly there is a level for which this exists. And of course we all understand through advancements in the material domain, in the sciences, that this is to be true, and that we can go quite deep and examine the fundamental structure of something. We can go so deep, I think, in fact, that we would lose the identity of what we are actually looking at. Now, I say this in the context of truth. Again, it is not my truth that this apple exists. It would support the fact that the apple exists if there were more accounts of this apple existing by other people, certainly. And the greater degree of accounts, the greater number of accounts, I should say, that agree on the various characteristics, that it also increases the reliability of our justification for the existence of this apple. But it is not that because I have a particular perspective, then I have a particular truth. It is not that way at all. It is because I have a particular perspective that I am limited to the whole of the truth. I'm limited to a small sliver of the truth. Now, the next place that I would like to go is back on this mountain of considering all of the different paths by which we can come to recognize something and characterize something into our formulation of what is in front of us, what is the cause of the processes, or the processes themselves that are responsible for what we see. Among all of these roads, and among the various landscapes that one inevitably encounters when hiking up a large mountain, I recognize that on this pursuit we are going up towards that divine peak, that peak of all-knowing and all-knowledge, for which the human being will never get to. The human being, in his experience, may be aware of this level, but he will not be able to see it with his senses. He may be able to augment with his tools and technology. But finding the creator of intelligibility through intelligibility is much like anything in our experience, really. Now, there's a way in which that's not true in an obvious sense, but there's another way in which it is true in the sense that we are perspectival beings, that we can only hold so much information. We can examine parts and elements of something. We can prove to ourselves and give ourselves justifications for our accounts, but we will always remain limited. And the greater the being or the process is that we have to analyze, the more it would seem that we take a view that is farther back, in the sense that we leave our experience behind as we remove the self to examine that which is. And I don't say that to say that this is not a worthy pursuit. It is the pursuit that we should undertake. But what I mean to say is that the human being on this mountain and on the various paths, will never reach the peak. But just because we won't reach the peak doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep on trying to improve ourselves. Because every step of the way towards that path, we discover new things. We improve ourselves, we improve our understanding, we improve our insights. And while our cultures and our societies, our civilizations may ebb and flow, for the most part, we retain elements of our understanding. And at every stage of development, we internalize that perspective. And so upon this landscape, I see a strange question that what necessarily would it mean for a person to be on this pursuit and to encounter the wicked? Surely the wicked are part of our experience. We are all on a part of this mountainous environment. And just because we wish ourselves to do good doesn't mean that there may not be a wicked person that is somewhere beyond our point in our hike up this mountain or on this trail. We may be surprised to find, especially as we get older and we grow wiser, that we are intimidated or we are subdued, blinded by a wicked person that would then call into question our experiences and our choices in life. The question in my mind is, given my understanding of my own life and my failures and what that necessarily has meant for me and how much I've learned from them, I wonder first and foremost, what exactly does it look like to fall before the wicked? And then secondly, if it does happen that we fall before the wicked, then how are we to save ourselves in this descent? Where is our salvation? And if this is not a precursor to Christ, it's difficult to say exactly what is. But that is far into the future for a further interpretation of the New Testament. But for now we remain in the Proverbs. We remain in chapter 25. And we remain in verse 26. A righteous man falling down before the wicked. So here we are, back in this landscape, back on this mountainous place. And all of a sudden something runs in front of us. This thing that we don't understand. It frightens us. It forces us to take a step back. Or perhaps even worse, we question ourselves. We think perhaps the pursuit that we are on is not worthwhile. And rather than stumble back out of a reflexive response, instead we turn the other direction and continue our lives and continuing our experience going back down the mountain. Now, of course, the symbol here, the meaning of this situation, is to imply that going back down the mountain, we're going down into lesser understanding, lesser truth, lesser integration, less poorer self-identity, inability to recognize other identities and how they are related. With every step that we take backwards, we are damaging ourselves. This falling down such an interesting description. Down rather than up, this sense of falling, being unable to stop ourselves from the descent, the moving away from something that is right, from something that is true. That somehow the way is no longer even appealing to us in such situations, for the wicked has a way of blinding the eyes. Up until this point, I've explored the term wicked quite a bit. Sometimes I'll use that etymological approach, and oftentimes I have difficulty remembering exactly the path that I've taken down that road, but generally speaking, I have come to the understanding that the wicked person is a selfish person, that they aren't necessarily oriented towards the good, although they may recognize it and they may do some good. It is not their fundamental prerogative to do it. They are primarily interested in themselves. They are a self-limiting species. They are driven by earthly things. They are driven by their own superficial desires. They care not much for attributing appropriate hierarchies to their feelings. The rationalizations remain superficial, although they may be highly intelligent, especially in gaining the objects of their desire. The wicked is something that is a person that is separated from that which is evil, in the sense that the wicked don't necessarily desire that everything that is come to be nothing, or at least they don't delude themselves into this belief. Though at a certain point it may be difficult to differentiate between a person that is wicked and a person that is evil, because they share many common traits. And no doubt, I'm sure that there are scholars out there that have a different frame of interpreting what these words mean, and I'm certainly open to expanding my view of these terms, but I think another way of looking at this is that wicked is a subset of evil, so perhaps it can still, that blood can still flow through the veins of evil, and it can be considered something that is evil. Almost like, since we were talking about the righteous is those who are committed to that which is right or true, but it is a path that one walks. It is that particular direction, and perhaps we can consider a person that is wicked as the opposite of righteous. That is that antagonism. That is a person that is marching towards that which is evil. But if one is to march towards that which is evil, then they are marching towards something that is fundamentally geared towards nothingness. They wish nothingness to consume all of intelligibility. There's an aspect of that too that we can consider that, but this is where I think that there is a lesser evil involved, and I consider this to be a wicked sort of thing, because true evil, it's interesting using that language, true evil. It is the true definition of that which is contrary. It would just seem to me the end of that road would be to desire for nothing to exist at all. And going off of that, if we are to go off of that definition, that the wicked is the type of individual that is moving on the path of evil, then once they get to that path of evil, or get to evil, they will understand that their true motive is actually towards destroying things for the sake of destruction, disintegration for the sake of disintegration, and not, and there is no desire for unification. So regardless of the particulars of the way in which one may characterize the word wicked, I think I'm going to continue with my original distinction that wicked is an aspect of the contrary person that may be quite intelligent, that may understand what they do, but they don't necessarily think in terms of the pure evil. They are too self-absorbed to really care much about that. Another association with the term wicked, before I move on, is the association between wicked and the wizard. the wizard being this sorcerer, this twister of the truth, finding strong truths, strong relationships between different identities, and then twisting them in the eyes and the perception of another, such that they cast their spells. That casting of a spell is the alteration of reality of another. But it could be towards many different purposes. It doesn't necessarily have to be towards the absence of being. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about here is the relationship or the image of this vertical. Since we were talking about down, we were talking about falling, we were thinking about a place that is higher versus a place that is lower. And obviously the place that is higher here is a place that is of more understanding, of higher truths, of greater integration. And as we fall away from that, we become disillusioned. We don't necessarily understand our place. We have a poor understanding of our own identity. We have a difficult time paying attention to qualities of things, perhaps because we don't know the point of doing so. I think part of the reason for faith is that we believe that there is a reason for integrating information and actually making sense of things. It's such a strange thing, the human mind, to be capable of such sophistication, but then also coming to a state of mind in which he or she feels as though that ability to organize information in such a way is meaningless, and therefore the very thought of identifying something and integrating it into something that makes sense is painful and actually contrary to who knows whatever the justification may be. This is sort of an aside, but as a part of my inability to understand music as well as I would like to, there are times in which I wonder about exactly what it is that I am hearing, about my understanding of the different tones and the scales, and if I'm ascending or descending a particular scale. This is particularly identifiable in classical music. Sometimes I find it funny that for whatever reason I can't seem to identify if something is going upwards or going downwards. It is a fundamental lack of my ability to hear that I envy certain people that have this gift for music. There are other times that I know for certain where I'm going and where I am. And as I think about that, I think about all of the different ways in which a person can ascend and descend something, or to experience and observe an ascent and descent. I think of the experience of going up and down stairs. And it's not as though going up or down stairs is a positive or negative. It depends on our purpose and exactly where we are going. But within the domain of morality, of goodness, when we say going up or going down something, it is quite clear. It's easy to identify. Now, what I mean by that is, it's easy to identify. Unlike the stairs, it depends on our purpose. Now, if going down the stairs is our purpose, then of course, going down is not seen as a bad thing. It would be seen as a bad thing if our purpose was to descend the stairs and yet somehow we tripped ourselves up and we fell up a stair or two backwards. That would be a negative thing. That would be a bad thing. It's obvious in the case of morality, regardless of, maybe I shouldn't say regardless of purpose, but independent of what we may think, what we may hear, the truth of the matter is the ascending and descending is fixed. What is good and bad is as it is. Of course, it depends, I think, in the human context, and in many contexts, upon the relationship of one thing to another. And purpose, I think, plays a role in there. But once we identify our problem, once we involve ourselves purposefully in something, the staircase of morality becomes clear. It becomes something that we can negotiate in the sense of navigating. And falling from that place is, I have to say, as I've mentioned already, is going from a place of understanding to a place of insecurity, of poor identification. Now, this may happen in all facets of our lives, that we may find ourselves in one place and then go down, be knocked down a few rungs, and I think about this professionally, in which I've made stupid mistakes doing God knows what, and I'm not paying attention. Some mistakes more serious than others. But upon reflection of them all, it's easy to identify where the mistake has been made. It's easy to identify where I have descended into a realm and a domain of ignorance and of incompetence that I wish not to be in, because I know it to be wrong. I know it to be wrong, again, because of the purposes and the objectives, the pursuits. Even among the pursuits and objectives, there is an organizer of them all. There's a centralizer of them all. It's easy to get lost in the sheer vastness of all of that interrelatedness, but undeniably it's there. So we have this conception of a person that is committed to a certain path. That certain path has a purpose towards a philosophical end, that is something towards that which is good. And there is a theological backing behind that says the end that is good is undergirded by an agent that is responsible for the creation of intelligibility, or of being, and of being, I should say. And because of this structure, there is a way of things. And because there is this way of things, it is possible to fall down and away from that path. And it is possible for us to have this experience in the face of something that is wicked, an agent, or a series of relationships that maybe we don't identify as an agent, but comes to us in an image that causes us to lose faith, that causes us to second-guess ourselves. And in fact, just thinking about this now, I had a situation today. It happens to be 9:30 at night at the moment, but during the working day, there's a situation in which I know that I could have handled the situation better. I could have been more patient. And that patience sometimes I don't know how it would be even possible to fetch my pail so far down that well to draw up any more. But I know it's always there, and it always exists, and I feel shame when I wish to deny myself the realization that it actually exists, that I can actually draw up more and still continue that path towards goodness despite a difficult situation. Now, the comparison here, a righteous man falling down before the wicked is as a troubled fountain and a corrupt spring. So let's begin with this troubled fountain. What exactly does this mean? So let's talk about this word, fountain. Now my mind almost immediately went to the ornamental structure, the fountain, in which there are jets that shoot water up into the air or wherever in a particular pattern. In the ancient world, they would have had this. Not necessarily the jets, per se, but they would have had a fountain. There would have been some source for which water was exiting an orifice that perhaps flowed to the city through an aqueduct, like in ancient Rome. In the literary sense, I think there is this conception of the fountain being the source of something, like the fountain of truth or the fountain of youth, the fountain of life. It is that beginning place through which our whatever we desire begins. It originates. The purity of a thing begins at the fountainhead. So immediately I have an image in my mind that as we have encountered this wicked person on our path of life, and they believe as they believe, they are attempting to twist the truth such that our vision is distorted, our perception of reality is distorted. And the way that we succumb to this, the way that we are knocked down from a place higher in terms of our moral standing or conception of our own identity or the identity, perhaps the purpose of the wicked person that is in front of us, is by being beset by some conflict. There is some disruption on the road within ourselves to the natural identity, towards that self-formation, the concreteness of being. There is a faltering of one's own foundational principles. I think of subversion. I think of deception in this situation. But all the same, since we are comparing this to a troubled fountain, I see the image again of this cylindrical object that is perhaps carried to a larger network that carries water through a series of pipes, and this water eventually goes through this cylindrical object, through the hole, and out into a broader pool of water. This is our fountain. This apparatus would be considered our fountain. And the place that the water flows out of the orifice, that cylindrical tube, I see as a very important place. It is the source of something. And the question is, well, what is the source of that place relative to how the wicked may disrupt our own fundamental foundations? For a troubled fountain would be, imagining again this physical structure, there would be something wrong with the purpose or the flow of water that is going through the tube. Perhaps there's some place farther up in the chain that is blocked that doesn't allow the water to get through. Perhaps there is some pollution along the way in the network that has caused everything downstream to become unusable. Its purpose is damaged. But again, that doesn't necessarily answer the question, what is the point at which the water flows out? And I've mentioned somewhat of an analogy between the two, that I mentioned that there are principles that form the fundamental qualities of an individual's identity, let's say. But this is not necessarily exactly, I think, analogous. I think what is more analogous, if the fountain is to be more of an essential aspect of our being that flows continuously from one state to another, from one place to another, in the case of an aqueduct that carries water from a place higher, perhaps up on a mountain or wherever, from a lake or a stream, and it flows down to where the city is, to where the human populace is. In the context of man, there is this trajectory, much like the network of tubing that perhaps exists out within the intelligible sphere, intelligible domain, for which that substrate or the substance of water, whatever the mindful parallel to that substance is, something that is a prerequisite for the maintenance of being. This flows independent of us. It is something that exists prior to our own existence. And eventually this thing comes together to form and to interact with us. And I think that there is a point at which we can identify that who we are, what we are, has come to us from a place that is outside, that is given to us to a degree. And since that it is given, it is something that is at once our own, but also I think we can find ourselves in a situation of losing our identity, such that in the recognition of that which has caused us to be, we have lost sight of who we are. And this is a rather convoluted chain of reasoning, I think. But I mean to say that at this point, at the source, at the inception of being, there is this possibility of faltering. Now, I choose to identify it here because it would seem to me that this is the farthest place back that we can go and still have a degree of agency, that we can still grab onto that which comes to us. We can still grab onto that thing that has caused us to be and develop a relationship with it, rather than to block it off and then to lose our relationship with it. And since we lose our relationship with it, we begin to lose ourselves, because there's really nothing, much like a house. If we introduced a bunch of termites into the house and they ate up all the wood and it became hollow, that structure would be something that just would not stand. It would not bear any load. Much like in the spiritual domain, I think the human being and his structural components of his identity would be hollowed out by a wicked person, the wicked termite in this, situation. And spiritually, he would begin to decay and to erode until the point that his own mind wouldn't be able to recognize itself as actually something that is a coherent agent. And that who he is just to be controlled or to be influenced, to be distorted by another. And I think in this way, it's quite easy to see how a man would be considered to be lower relative to a place where he is connected to that being, that source of intelligibility, rather than some falsehood or some poisoned water, a poisoned well, or a blocked tube, such that the fountain no longer has a flow to it, that we can't, although we can identify its source, the source is not productive, it's not producing. A corrupt spring, I think, is a similar analogy, in the sense that for a spring to be corrupt, this is like a small flowing of water, like a creek, At least I imagine this in my mind. And for corruption to flow through it, I would imagine perhaps like a dead animal is within that stream and it pollutes it. It is no longer usable by the human being to sustain himself in the similar fashion that the fountain in the metaphorical flow of being is no longer able to reach him, so that everything downstream will die. Now I would like to tie this verse up, but I think that there's another thing that I need to say about everything that just had transpired there. I use two terms, the term being and the term intelligibility. And perhaps I use them interchangeably. They seem to be related, surely. Being is, from my point of view, something that expresses existence. It is something that is. I have a being in the sense that I myself, as I speak into this microphone, I am consciously doing so. I'm making the decision to explore and to activate my mind such that I am purposefully directed. I am paying attention to this moment. I'm paying attention to what I'm saying. I'm trying to get a point across. I'm trying to solve a problem. The problem, perhaps I could say in this situation, is interpreting the verse, but also solving a larger problem that's on top of that. A problem that is much deeper, more personal, more foundational. The problem of the question, who am I? Who am I to be? How am I to be? Building the self, building the identity. Now, of course, all of this is intimately related to the word intelligibility, which seems to be something that is more conceptual. It refers to the capacity to understand something, for the mind to comprehend it. A quality that makes something clear, distinct, and again capable of being grasped or comprehended. So it's an interesting thing for being something that would pre-exist me, my own self having this form, this being. And because I possess this agency, that I am now trying to understand what that thing is. And I think that the point of this verse is to say that in order to understand a person that is on the righteous path, which we ought to be if we are to be considering the Bible, and to be walking in that, attempting to walk in the righteous path, that we are recognizing that there is a way to that which is right. There's a way to that which is right that doesn't just involve material things, that it moves beyond the material. It infuses itself at our level of experience, at our being. That within the domain of morality, we can identify things that are good, things that are bad. We can recognize things that are higher or lower relative to something else. And much like our being, we can say and we can recognize that there is something, although very highly contextual and often difficult to nail down, that this thing is independent of us. Although our experience is a fundamental part, of course. We, as these types of agents, produce a lot of this narrative. We produce it in the sense that we can see it. We produce in the sense that we build. We build in order to afford a higher perch for which we can see. And because that there are all of these complex interactions, and because of our own agency being this thing that belongs intimately to us, and our experience is very important, not only to us, but also, I think, in terms of the environment, the way that we behave and live out our lives, that the way that we come to understand who we are, what our purpose is, how we conceive of the reality, of nature, of human interaction, all of this can be undergirded. We can be put under a spell. Again, I think of the term wicked coming from terms in the past relating to sorcery, which I think is directly related to this type of behavior. The type of individual that is highly intelligent, but also highly self-motivated, that doesn't care much for the good or the bad within that domain of thinking. They care only for their desires. They prop themselves up at the altar. That what they revolve around is not necessarily some external thing, some high external thing. It is themselves. They are autoaxial in nature. And because of this, they can distort those fundamental components of an agent conceptualizing of himself, the intelligible aspect, but also integrating the components of being, in the sense that, now this is where I think they really overlap, because integrating the components of being is something that exists. But a self is something that we can say perhaps it exists, but it can also grow. And now there's only one being, and we are not the beings that can see this way, that would understand all possibilities and sees the self for what it is and what it is to become. From our own perspective, the role of the wicked tempts us to lose aspects of being, such that what we are becomes unrecognizable, that our own agency is undermined, and that our own ability to modify and to see what can be in terms of our own productive behaviors, of our ability to treat each other well. I'll use a concrete example here so I don't sound like Kamala Harris. That today, in the past week really, I've been thinking a lot about my behavior. I've been thinking a lot about how I interact with people. I've been thinking a lot about norms and traditions, what it necessarily means to shake somebody's hand, all the subtleties that go in that, the firmness of a handshake, the connection that we have with one another when we lock eyes, the expressions that we put forth, the intent, the tonality of our voice, all of this stuff is something that we can attend to and is something that we can control. It is something that is intelligible, in other words. And I think for something that is, for a being that is, if somebody is to be a good person, then they recognize the aspects of our understandable or intelligible world that are good, and they integrate those things within them. So, for example, I've been trying to do good things. I've been trying to, not that I necessarily haven't done this before, but now it's much more of a conscious thing, that when I approach somebody for the first time and I meet them, I make sure it is a point that I look in their eyes, I shake their hand, and it is a firm handshake, regardless of whether or not their handshake is firm, and I say what my name is. And I begin by unfolding and trying to find things that are good, rather than just sort of mindlessly feeling around in the darkness for some good thing to occur to me. I'm using my agency. And again, I like to reiterate that the wicked is the type of person or the situation, the pattern that we come in contact with that would undermine that agency, undermine the potential for which we can pursue that which is good and integrate it into what we are. It is not good to eat much honey, so for men to search their own glory is not glory. So within this chapter, this is our second verse that references the word honey. I'm trying to find the first one. The first one is verse 16. Have you found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for you, lest you be filled therewith and vomit it. Now this chapter is not the first time that we've come across the reference to honey. It's certainly a productive exercise to imagine what that honey symbolizes. So let's begin with the first half of this verse. It is not good to eat much honey. So the first thing that we have to do is to really fluff up, or to open the portal to what the word honey means, or what it can mean. Let's give it a solid identity. So let's start basic with many of our personal, individual experience. Honey is something that is sweet. It is something that is found in nature. Something that is produced by bees, a being that is independent of ours. Honey, I think in the broader sense, since it is sweet, is something that is desirable. It is something that in large quantities it would not be something that's considered to be good for us. We can overindulge on the sweetness. We can utilize its natural qualities and the natural appeal that it has from our perspective. We could turn it into something that becomes a vice. But we can also say that because that honey is sweet, it is good. It tastes good to us. And that goodness is not arbitrary. I think that there is actual goodness there. But it depends on something. It depends on the context. It depends on, in this situation, it depends on the amount. For it says, it does not say that it is not good to eat honey. It says it is not good to eat much honey. So my apologies, but today is a new day, and it will take me some time to recover where I had just been. The last couple of days I've taken off, I guess, from recording. And the reason for that is I was helping a friend of mine build a grill out of brick. And so it took us a considerable amount of time. And I was faced with a bit of a dilemma, of course, because I didn't have, or at least I perceived that I didn't have enough time to do my recordings for the day. And it opened up a broader thought about the sacrifices that I make in my life, and how I can more effectively make sacrifices so that I am doing what I should be doing, that I am serving that divine logos, serving God as I should. And of course, there are many times of frustration. There are plenty of times that I indulge in too much of one thing and not enough of another. That I am too quick to accept the comfort over the pain, or over something that I have to devote a significant amount of attention to. Now, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that the sacrifices that I make or anybody makes in life need to be sacrifices that produce them pain. But the aspect of challenge, the aspect of some discomfort, and the short-term sacrifice for the long-term gain, I think, is something that we should all keep in mind. It's something that I know that I need to keep in mind more often. And as I have progressed through these Proverbs, I have noticed that there is a change in my character, surely. But at the same time, I noticed how slow that change can be. And thinking about this verse, it is not good to eat much honey. I think about all the different things in my life that are honey, that would appear to be honey. The things that are sweet and readily consumable, immediately gratifying. And for my part, I think that my engagement with the broader digital world is my sin. It is something that I consume too much of. I eat too much of that honey, whereas in a particular context, taking in a particular amount of information may be fine, but there is a point at which the consumption of too much information causes harm, it causes damage. Now, I know that this theme or this sentiment is something that I have brought up in relation to this verse in my interpretation. What I would like to do now is to focus on that aspect of consumption or of participation that approaches the threshold for which, on one side, we have healthy participation, and on the other side, the opposite, that our participation with whatever it is, in this case it's the honey, but again, the honey that's extended out into everything that we can imagine within our lives that is sweet, maybe somewhat relieving, that we may have the tendency to overindulge in. These two sides and the middle that point to transgression I find to be fascinating. Now, the second half of this verse opens up a lot, but I think the first part, our goal is to establish if we are going to be strong agents. One of the things that we have to do in order to bolster ourselves is to be able to readily identify that which is good for us and that which is bad for us, and the amounts therein. And also, obviously, the line of transgression, as I've mentioned. So I think there's really no better way to do this than to pick a personal example and to break that down and to go from there. So I have already mentioned that I struggle with information consumption. And in particular, I like to watch videos on YouTube. Sometimes the videos are productive, at least I try to convince myself that they're productive. They can't be all that productive if I'm passively engaged with it, but there are plenty of podcasts that I like to listen to. Some on foreign affairs, some more scientific, some a little bit more informal. There are other videos that I watch that I may characterize as unwinding type videos, in which maybe it's somebody that's reacting to a song that I enjoy. These sorts of things, although at the surface, really don't seem to be bad, but if it's consumed for hours on end, it surely is. And like with anything, I think an overconsumption of something will present itself in different ways. The information consumption, which I think is our primary, well, maybe I shouldn't say primary, but is one of the temptations that we are afforded in the modern age. One of the negative effects of the overconsumption, overstimulation by too much information is the destruction of one's attention and the difficulty of putting one's mind in the driver's seat and regaining control, regaining some sort of competent agency to make effective decisions. And it's such a terrible thing, I think, to witness it happen to oneself, but also to our broader society as a whole. So I'll propose the question. I think there are a series of questions here that relate to more broader and sophisticated questions. But of the information issue, how do I know when I've spent too much time consuming information off of the internet? By what dimension can I say, and can I exercise and give a good account to that judgment that would appropriately tell me or justify when I have gone too far? Now, it's easy to understand after we have transgressed, because then we will be dealing with the fallout, the negative consequences. And so I'm not sure that we can go by that, because we don't want to continue to engage that would tempt us to engage in the same behavior, only to justify to ourselves then that we have to transgress in order to understand where the boundary is, and then move it back from there. The mind is an interesting thing. At least I've found in my experience that sometimes it's not really a matter of when the effects come, because every day is different. Sometimes the mind will be satisfied to continue doing nothing as long as it is able, or there will be something in the mind on a different day that will prompt it to consider that what the behavior and activity that it is engaged in is actually unproductive. That small anxiety, or perhaps large anxiety, is quite a useful tool. So this approach, of course, will not work, so we have to identify a different approach. And for this, I think about the philosophical approaches. For if it's nearly impossible to understand at what point we have crossed the boundary, at least objectively, then we have to give ourselves principles to go by, so we fortify ourselves against such forms of transgression. Now, we can limit it to a particular amount of time, but in my experience, it would seem that the most productive use, the safest use for technology, is to place it behind everything that I know ought to be done before I engage in that. Now that may be equally as difficult of a question to answer. But a pious practice, or any regular participation in something that there is this theme of short-term discomfort or sacrifice for a long-term gain, I think is a beneficial pursuit over that of the superficial. And I suppose that there are philosophies out there that dictate that there should be no engagement with the superficial, for it does not bring us anything. And to this I think that, although it may be true, the mind does seem to respond well to a period of rest. Now, I've discussed before the difference between unproductive leisure and productive leisure. That productive leisure is something that we do in our off time, let's say off time from work, that is sustaining to us, that builds us up. It might be of the similar caliber of sacrifice that we are looking for long-term gains, so we make that short-term sacrifice. But in these sorts of situations, they don't necessarily feel like work or a chore. They are a pleasure to do, much like it is a pleasure just to lay down, put some headphones on, and do nothing. But these pleasures are entirely different. And I think the pleasure of the former allows us to understand that transgression is likely not to be reached because of the sacrifices that we are making. We are constantly giving up something in return for something else. We are not just taking and passively consuming life. We are active participants in it. It is not good to eat much honey. So for men to search their own glory is not glory. Now this part of the verse is something that fascinates me. Because there is an equivalency here that I had not recognized in the first part of the verse when I had interpreted it. So for men to search their own glory is not glory, implying that given man is an agent and his willful desire for that concept of glory, his agency is the very thing that causes glory not to be found, or it causes it to be unintelligible, perhaps, unattainable. And if it is something that is unattainable by him, then it must be something that is given to him. Now, before we get into that potential path or interpretation, I want to talk a little bit about the word glory, and also what it means to imagine that landscape for which a man is searching for something like glory, because obviously there's nothing in front of me that would even approach glory. It's not an object, it's a material. So before I had Googled the definition of glory, I was trying to think of some words that I thought would encompass the definition of the word glory. And I thought the definition of that word would be something an idea, I guess it could be an object, that is elevated relative to something else, that it possesses some intelligible quality, intelligible quality, a particular type of intelligible quality, because obviously all things that exist have an intelligible quality, but it is more than just existing. And here I pause because I wonder if it actually is more than just existing, or it's existing in a way that's different from something that is more basic. But either way, let's take something that is intelligible, something that exists. And I say, out of this thing that exists, the thing that is basic, is it glory? Now, I'm not really worried about my glory. I'm curious about finding glory out in the environment. Let's say it's a rock. I'm not sure I would be able to necessarily understand if I asked myself, is the rock glory? The rock is many things. The rock has many qualities to it. Can one of the potential qualities of that rock be glory? And I think that the answer is yes. But glory is not something that the rock possesses necessarily, which is strange. If I say it's a quality, then surely it possesses its own qualities. And perhaps I have to use different language here. But glory is something that we attribute to, in this case, an object. We can just as easily do it to a person or a country, a group, an institution, whatever. But to this rock, before I had come upon it, before I had recognized something magnificent or beautiful about it, and in that way I would attribute glory to it, the only other thing that would be there to appreciate it would be the originator of intelligibility itself, which would be God. And so it's given in a strange way, or maybe I should say that it is recognized by the agents in the arena, but it is given only by God. For magnificence and beauty, I think, can be found in anything. But it is a matter of seeing things in a particular light. And the way in which I think the light shines upon a particular thing depends upon the agent that is doing the looking. And it is within that relationship, that sort of observer-participant relationship, that causes this glory to manifest. Now let me go over some of the definitions of the word glory, and I'll come back to that line of reasoning to see if it holds. So the first definition of glory: high renown or honor, won by notable achievements. Second is magnificence or great beauty. Third, praise, worship, and thanksgiving offered to some deity. 4, a luminous ring or halo, especially as depicted around the head of Jesus Christ or a saint. As a verb, glory can mean take great pride or pleasure in. to exult in unpleasantly or boastfully. So in all of these things, there is this sense of elevation. I could just take a few words out of each one of these definitions. High renown, honor, magnificence, beauty, distinctive, special cause, pride, praise, worship, luminous. All of these terms in my mind seem to form this image, this shining object that seems to be something that is so desirable, almost like this honey, that I reach my hand out and try to grasp it, almost like I'm reaching my hand out to grasp water to quench my thirst, and yet it's as if my hand, as poor as it is to gather water, there's an additional insult in the sense that there's a bunch of different holes in my hand and I can no longer hold the water, and it leaks right through. In this way, it seems that when I, for example, reach out for glory, and I try to consider in my life if I have tried to do this. I'm sure I have at some point. I think sometimes it's harder to understand how it manifests necessarily, more so than if it is the case that I do it at all. And of the cases that I likely perform in this behavior, it is probably the case that I praise myself highly, certain qualities or successes that I have had, and to them I attribute pride, a sense of self-satisfaction and self-elevation in this metaphorical landscape. But my believed prestige really has nothing to do with my actual prestige, my actual honor. If I have won something by my own standards, perhaps it makes me feel good, but my own standards are insular. They cannot exist on their own, much like my own identity cannot exist on its own. It requires information to come from without. And I think even one's own standards, as selfish as they may seem, they at one time were formed by information that existed or exists outside of themselves. And that may be a difficult thing to rationalize. But I think if we refer to the first part of the verse, we have the key that unlocks that door. For if a person is overindulgent in something that they find appealing, the appeal will be the temptation into darkness, because it is their engagement and their own selfish pursuit of something that they know to be good at one level, but they wish to take that good from that level and put it at a different level. In the case of the honey, for example, it is a good at some level. It's a relatively superficial level, I would imagine. It is something that we use to enhance our food. Perhaps, as I understand, honey has some medicinal qualities to it. I think it's antimicrobial, and it has some nutrients that are beneficial to the body. But we all understand the dangers of a lot of sugar. And it is once this attractive aspect, which isn't even necessarily the good aspects of the honey that actually benefit us. It is more the superficial taste that draws us to its consumption, to consume it, it is when that draw towards that level of participation, or that superficial good, because I think we can say that enjoying something that is sweet may provide us with some good. The good is that it is attractive and that it is satisfying. Now, of course, it doesn't take much thought to understand how that only goes so far. And to the point where we begin to damage our teeth or become sick because we've eaten too much of it, then it is clear that we have transgressed. We have gone too far. And I imagine also that there is this relationship within the internal domain, within the subjective sphere, that there is plenty within the mind, if I go within myself, that I may find attractive. I find just the thought of sitting with my thoughts attractive. But it is not something that can be sustained forever. One's sociability, one's development, not only socially, but also intellectually, one's development spiritually, religiously, in the directional sense of understanding how exactly things are related to one another, would be inherently disrupted because of the overindulgence of the internal domain. That internal domain is something that is intimately connected to the external environment, external events, people, other selves, other agents. And to deny that is, I think, similar to denying that the sweetness of honey as the thing that draws us to it, at that level, is more than it actually is. And in this way, there is this check on one's own desire, because one can desire something that is more than it actually is, or that we wish it to satisfy us more than it actually can. And the unfortunate bit is we may not even understand how much it is harming us until it's too late, before the cells within the pancreas can no longer produce a sufficient amount of insulin to take in glucose from the blood and provide our organs with necessary energy, and at which point the organs begin to fail. We lose sensation in our extremities, all this sort of thing that's associated with diabetes. So in the sense that it is not good to overindulge in honey, to transgress that barrier for which that which is actually good becomes bad, in a like manner, if man tries to look for his glory, they will not find it. It will be something that turns into something that is the opposite. Whereas glory can be seen as something that is good, and then searching for his own glory can be seen as something that is bad. Now, I'll say one or two more things about this, because I don't think I'm entirely satisfied with this reflection so far. I feel that there's an image, a good image, to be realized here, about a man that searches for his glory. I really want to understand what that might look like, what it might mean. So I'll begin by asking myself the question, what does it mean to search for something? Let's say I have misplaced my phone, which I often do. I'm looking all over the place. I'm ruffling the bed covers to see if I had lost it in there somehow. I'm looking through my laundry to see if it is in the pocket of my pants that I had worn the day prior. In the process of doing this, my searching is meant to find the object of my desire. Now, if I were to say to myself, that it is possible to have an object of your desire, at the same time, it is possible for that same object to never be found. That would be quite the interesting riddle. Because obviously my phone doesn't fall into that category. There are plenty of things that would not fall into that category. Virtually all material things, or most material things. So there may be some things that I don't understand that would fit that scenario. But I think generally what we are after here is immaterial things. So if I'm thinking in the immaterial domain, I suppose I can ask myself the question, are there things that I can find, or that are the objects of my desire that I can find? And I think that the answer is yes. If I desire connection with a friend, I can ask him or her to go and hang out and go out to eat. And at some point, given my exchange, the object of my desire will be found. I will find joy. I will find that connection. I suppose in that situation it's not the same as my phone being the object of desire, because it depends on another agent. It would be impossible for the situation in which, let's say my friend, his agency was reduced, he was on some anesthetic or something, and I wish to establish a connection with this person. Maybe it's possible, given a situation where a good friend of mine finds himself in the hospital and I am there to console him, but maybe he's in a coma or whatever. I think there's a way that there's a connection that can be had there from an individual standpoint, but with regard to a mutual building, this sort of thing is dependent on somebody else, and it can't necessarily be found by the insular experience. There has to be an outward expression and also an influx of information. That there is almost a bridge that connects immaterial things together, one agent to another. Now, in another way, I can imagine another scenario in which perhaps the object of my desire is love. And much like the scenario of bondedness and of connection to a friend, love is something that is quite a deep emotion that is tied intimately to reason. If the object of my desire is love, I think there is a way in which I can go out and I can find it. But I can only find it in the sense that there must be a reciprocation. Otherwise, I am taking too much. like in this scenario of the honey. And at a certain point, I will transgress, and it'll no longer be this sweet goodness. It'll be something that is harmful for me. In a way that if I am going out and I'm forcing somebody to be with me and trying to convince myself that they love me, just as I've eaten a beehive's worth of honey and now I'm sick and trying to convince myself that no, I'm actually still enjoying it, it's not true. But this business of glory, I apologize if I've gone over the same territory a few times. Much like love, I think I can desire glory. And much like love, it is not something that I can just give to myself. I can have love for myself. But it is another thing to be loved by somebody else. And a reward and an achievement is recognized by an apparatus, an institution, or a divine spirit that understands what true achievement is, that sets the standard for that achievement. And by that standard existing independent of the agent, it is possible for this thing called glory or something called love to manifest and to grow and to connect. He that has no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. So it's an interesting verse. It's a good verse to follow up that previous one about the honey. Because in the example of the honey, we're talking about, in a sense, self-deception. We're talking about the relationship of the self to the world, the reality that is outside of his own perceived experience. A term that is thrown around often, I think, in some circles at least, in the modern era, is the axial age, referring to a period of history that I believe dates around 800 BC and 200 BC, in which a period of philosophical advancement, spiritual advancements, occurred simultaneously in various parts of the globe. And by these advancements, people began to, not that they hadn't before, but even in a broader way, more abstract and universal way, people started to offload things into broader formal concepts that didn't depend on the superficial nature, that it didn't depend on the sweetness of the honey. It then depended on the now this wouldn't be an exact parallel, but just for argument's sake, that if we understood something about the honey that was beneficial to us, we would consume it more so for that purpose rather than for its sweetness. Its sweetness would also be a purpose, but we would value more highly different principles according to their merit in terms of justice, morality, and all of this sort of thing. And that last verse is similar in that regard, because our glory is not something that is within, it is something that is given to us by our participation in the world, by our realization of principles that exist in the world. And in a like manner, there's also this flip on the other side of the coin, in which, while this may be true, it's not necessarily the denial of the self that we are concerned with here. It's not as though we are saying that we find principles at the expense of the self so that we can then transcend and and become something different. It is in a way, because we always wish to improve ourselves and to be born anew. But the self retains its agency, it retains its identity. The thing here is, as we identify principles without the superficial restraints, perhaps, of the self, that desire things that exist at a certain level, but we wish to integrate that into our core being and have that really resolve our problems. But of course, eating honey is not going to solve the issue of a loved one passing away. It's not going to solve the issue of an existential dilemma or problem. It is not going to solve a math problem. It may cause the mind to become, or to be at ease because of the sugary rush, but this, of course, is not the thing that we can say that solves the problem that plagues us. And when I say this flip, he that has no rule over his own spirit, we have a pivot to now saying, instead of saying that we are focused on the principles that exist independent of the self, now we are saying that the self has a strong role in identifying and maintaining the sense of agency such that he is able to not be fooled by searching for his own glory, and rather to participate in the world with a degree of selflessness, while it's almost like a paradox, while maintaining a strong sense of self and identity. He that has no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. So to begin here, I would like to discuss the word spirit, and then get into all of the other terms, what it means to rule over it, what it means for the part of ourselves that, if we can think of it in this way, has the authority to rule over that thing that we call the spirit. Now, throughout the Proverbs, I have attempted to use different illustrations to help myself to understand what the spirit is and what it means. When I think of the word spirit, I suppose it's possible to go back to our etymological roots here, to Latin. This word spirit comes from the Latin spiritus, which means breath or breathe. Now, it's an interesting thing to think about, what our breath is, because we can think about our breath in the physical sense. Our breath in the physical sense is related to many different things. Of course, it sustains us. It's something that we need. We need oxygen. But we also use it to manipulate sound, to push air through our vocal cords, and to use our mouth to manipulate words, such that we can have language, that we can put meaning forward into the external domain to be understood by other agents. And I think it is in the immaterial sense, in the sense that our breath is our life, but it's not our life in the sense of the physical. It is our life in terms of the awareness, the consciousness of mind. And in terms of that aspect of life, in terms of consciousness and awareness, there comes this idea of the spirit, that it is something that is independent of the physical. It's it's retained within that physical substructure, that physical prerequisite in our case. But the spirit is something that transcends. It is something that is, again, of mind. There is an essential component to it in which our very existence depends on it. And of the things that it depends on, I've listed a few: of mind, of self-awareness, consciousness. Now I find it interesting to reflect on my own consciousness and my own awareness, my own spirit, as something that is independent of my bodily needs and desires, that this agent has become something quite fascinating. And to think about my own self, the landscape of self, my identity. And much like within a state, there may be various groups of people living in various different ways, various institutions, and all of these different components are articulating together and relating to one another to form the identity of that state. Just as within me there are memories, experiences, there are preferences, desires, many things that come to form who I am. And yet, it seems to be that the voice that is speaking is the ruler. It is the one that directs. It is the one that controls, steers the ship. And that there may be parts of me that desire one thing or another. Perhaps I desire at this moment sleep. Perhaps I desire that honey. Perhaps I desire any number of things that are other than what the spoken part of me is participating in or willfully enacting. Regardless of those pieces of myself, of that pull, and at this moment I can't honestly say that I feel much of a pull anywhere but here. But I supposed if I had thought about it long enough, I would find something. But regardless of that, I am here, and I am willfully participating in this experience. And in that way, I find myself ruling over my spirit. I am in charge of this experience. That myself is not necessarily influenced or is not directed in any strong way by another agent, in the sense that I consider the way in which a man can direct another man's will and desires. I suppose at some level there is some degree of agency that is interacting with my participation in the world, and I don't know how it is, but for my immediate experience, in which whether it be an institution, and when I think of an institution, I think of my occupation, I think how that business, the corporate entity, the corporate spirit, influences my own behavior. I think of how the spirit of that, the physical place that I work, the people that are in it, influence me. I think of how the procedures influence me. think about our culture more generally. And as if this experience now is certainly a bizarre one of many different psychological operations and forces that wish to take control and to utilize our own attention for their own purposes. In this way, if I were in a situation other than the situation that I am in now, of the plenty of different examples that I've put forth, I can imagine that this experience would be quite different. Not necessarily bad, but there is a point at which I suppose, just like the honey in the previous example, that some sort of transgression will have occurred, and that I have sacrificed too much of my own identity and agency to something else, such that I no longer have rule over my own spirit, like a city that is broken down and without walls. Something that is ineffective as a principality, something that can't defend itself, something that can easily be overtaken by an enemy or somebody that wishes to use that infrastructure for their own cultural expression, their own experience. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. We're done with chapter 25. And we're going to continue next time with chapter 26. This journey of the Proverbs has been quite long so far. As much as I've enjoyed it, I'm looking forward to finishing it so I can move on to and return to Plato. But I'm going to be in here for some time yet. For 5 chapters will take me a long time. But in any case, this is my closing to this chapter.